as a foundation, we are talking to people globally all the time. I also believe that when we say 1 in 5 or 20%, that is grossly underestimated. And part of that is because if you look at our nation's report card, 66% of fourth graders can't read on grade level. And then that number gets worse when they test again at eighth grade. So clearly we're doing something wrong. I mean, that surely it can't be that 65% of our kids not being able to read at grade level is an acceptable standard. But, how many of those kids even have, mild dyslexia, maybe not with dysgraphia, but when you get the proper instruction, I mean, it's game changing.
Thomas Edison, Richard Branson, John F. Kennedy, Mozart, Michael Jordan, Will Smith. That sounds like a list of highly successful titans in a variety of vocations. Why is it that we rarely hear that they have or had ADHD? And you know what we hear even less about? Serena Williams, Emma Watson, Mel Robbins, Whoopi Goldberg, Agatha Christie, Erin Brockovich, Cher. Yeah, the successful women navigating ADHD. And that's exactly why I started this podcast, ADHD for Smartass Women. I'm your host, Tracy Otsuka. I'm a lawyer, not a doctor, a lifelong student, now a coach. I'm also the creator of Your ADHD Brain is A-OK, a system that helps people like you figure out what they should do with their life. And we're here today to talk ADHD, your strengths, your symptoms, your workarounds, and how you proudly stand out instead of trying to fit in. I credit my ADHD for some of my greatest gifts. And you know what? I spy a happier life for you too. So without further ado, a shiny new episode is starting now. Hello, I am your host, Tracy Otsuka. Thank you so much for joining me here for episode 155 of ADHD for Smartass Women. I hope you'll subscribe to this podcast, ADHD for Smartass Women, and our newsletter over at tracyotsuka.com. My purpose is always to show you who you are and then inspire you to be it, if I could speak. In the thousands of ADHD women that I have had the privilege of meeting, I've never met a one that wasn't truly brilliant at something. Not one. And Jennifer Knopf is no exception. So I met Jennifer a few months ago when she sent me an email. I had just interviewed educational diagnostician Lori Peterson, and I had told the story of my ADHD son who had just been diagnosed with dyslexia. And I was talking about how prior to Lori, it was so hard to find anyone who looked at learning challenges in an integrative way. In my experience, you have experts who know dyslexia and experts who know ADHD and experts who know visual processing and so on and so on. But no one seemed to understand how all these learning challenges integrated. And the thing is that there are so many comorbidities with ADHD that it's imperative that the people we're going to get help from know more than just their one area. I then said, if it was this hard for us as a family to finally figure this out after a decade, how does anyone else who has less resources than we do get help? I mean, it's literally impossible. And so that is how I met Jen. She reached out to me. We ended up talking. It turns out she's working on this very issue, and we had a lot in common. So I am just delighted to introduce you to Jen Knopf today. Jen is the founding director of Charitable Foundation, which is a public 501c3 that is committed to putting an end to the literacy crisis and ensuring all children learn to read, write, and spell by providing financially accessible, best-in-class structure literacy training known as Orton-Gillingham to all teachers. Jen is wife to husband Andrew and mom to two amazing kids, a daughter Mackenzie and a son Reed, who was diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia in January of 2018 at 7 years old and ADHD at 10 years old. Her son Reed's story of both struggle and strengths is the inspiration for Reed Charitable Foundation, but her heart for RCF, as she calls it, goes much deeper than that. Jen studied at the University of Florida and gained her BS in psychology with highest honors. She then obtained her Juris Doctorate, cum laude, from Stetson University College of Law and was part of its nationally ranked trial team. Jen's background as both a litigation and commercial real estate attorney made her uniquely suited for researching and advocating for her own son's needs. But she quickly learned that their family's battle to find support for her son's dyslexia is a battle that at least 20% of the population also faces. She also eventually learned that 65% of instruction that supports dyslexic students is actually considered the best type of literacy instruction for all students. Further, as she continued on this journey, she learned that ADHD is a very common comorbidity with dyslexia. They have similar characteristics, so one or both can get missed and often do. And at the age of 43, through her research to support her son and all kids like him, Jen learned that she herself has lived with undiagnosed ADHD her whole life. With her legal background, relentless determination, thank you, ADHD, and a steadfast belief that literacy is a fundamental human right, Jen is committed to the mission and purpose of this foundation named after her beloved son. Oh my God, Jen, did I get all that right?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm just delighted to have you come talk about what it is that you do and your experiences and all of that. But first, I would love to talk about ADHD, your ADHD diagnosis. Is that okay?
Sure.
So can you tell me about it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Tracy, for having me. What an incredible honor. And really, my ADHD diagnosis that happened this year is largely as a result. I really credit you and of course my son Reed. So I'll I'll say that, of course, Reed is kind of the catalyst for so much of what I've really learned in the last almost 4 years because of his dyslexia and kind of the journey that's taken us on. But when he was diagnosed with ADHD at the end of last year, his psychiatrist, her name is Dr. Brady Bradshaw, and she's here locally in Orlando, Florida. And she sent me your podcast, and it was the interview that you did with Dr. Hallowell. And I run on my podcast listening days. And I basically didn't run during that podcast because I kept stopping to take notes. And by the time I got home, I was kind of in this stupor of, oh my gosh, I mean, could I have ADHD? So many of the issues and topics that were discussed in that interview with Dr. Hallowell and how ADHD can present itself in women and how that's oftentimes quite different than how it looks in young boys and men just absolutely stopped me dead in my tracks. And then I sat here for the longest time, and then still wet and sweaty from exercising, I got on my computer and emailed Dr. Hallowell. And because what we do as a foundation amongst, the training and things is also really trying to provide exceptional content for families to really support them in this journey, because to your point, there's so few places to really get exceptional and correct content. And so he agreed to do a community education event for us. And he, of course, was amazing and really taught myself and so many that listen to our organization about ADHD and women versus boys and medication and addiction. And so many myths were debunked. And at the end of that interview with him, he was like, I really want to assess you. And I was like, well, I would be honored. And I've been wondering myself, kind of based on what I'm hearing about what it looks like in women. And so he and I met separately, and I got my ADHD diagnosis, and now I see our psychiatrist locally. And it's not only changed my life and made so much sense of the last 43 years of my life, that I made up excuses and reasons for certain things, and I had a justification for everything. But it really has changed a lot of women that I know and that are a part of RCF. I share your podcasts, and many of us are getting diagnosed, and it's really a credit to you and the work that you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that, for those kind words. So I'm curious, what were some of the symptoms that, you had basically decided that it was because of other things, but now they're symptoms of ADHD. So you said for 43 years you'd been making excuses. What were they?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm definitely high functioning, and both Dr. Hallowell and Dr. Bradshaw, I have somehow come up with the coping mechanisms that you read about, but no one told me. I just stumbled into them. But I would say some of the things that really hit home initially were in listening to your podcast with Dr. Hallowell were rumination was a really big one for me. Interrupting, kind of, there's a couple different things for me. I think I tend to interrupt, which is so annoying, and I constantly try to control that. And I'll even think sometimes in conversations before I go into them, do not do that. Like, just listen, just listen. But there's a part of me that, somebody says something and it triggers a thought, and I'm afraid I'm going to forget it,
Yes.
and so it's like you just got to get it out there. And I see that in my son so much, and in my daughter also, actually. And I always thought that was just like, gosh, it's just kind of rude, because of course that's what I was told as a kid and growing up and being a woman. We're supposed to not interrupt people and be polite. And so I kind of always was like, why can't I control that, even when I'm conscious of it and going into a conversation and telling myself not to do it? And I still can't resist the urge.
Have you had people tell you, I've heard this a couple times, and every single time it's just kind of like a knife to the heart. Can you just stop for a minute and let me get a word in edgewise?
Of course. Of course. And of course, it's probably why we're both lawyers.
Right, because we don't let you look at a word in edgewise.
Yes. And I think another thing with that, so then the rumination piece comes in, right? So
Mm.
after those
Mhm.
conversations, I'm like, why did you do that? Why did you say that? Oh, why? And I also ruminate about what I didn't say. And
Yep.
it's kind of like that self-fulfilling prophecy problem where I'm like, see, that's why I can't not interrupt, because then I forget to say the, thing that I really wanted to say. And that would have been so persuasive or helpful or whatever. And so it's this, that, there's a do loop that I spend inordinate amounts of time in, and like really wish I'd said something differently, or I forgot to say something. And it probably didn't impact anything, if I rationally look at it. But I'll stay up all night, can't sleep, thinking about how I could have done it better. And I've been that way, my whole life. Like, that's a really big common theme for me, even now.
Can I ask you, is that interrupting, what didn't I say, what did I say, rumination loop, is it better now that you know why?
Yes, for sure. And because I understand where it's coming from, I can quiet my mind much better. Whereas before, um, I would associate what I thought people thought and then attribute that to myself. And then now that's, impacting how you feel about yourself, and what you perceive other people think about. I mean, what an awful, like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh. And so that I would say that's a big one for me, but also like definitely perfectionism, tendencies, which to me growing up and learning about ADHD, I wouldn't think that an ADHD personality would be a perfectionist at all, or being hyper organized and, or hyper focused. Like that's the opposite of what we make it sound like. So 1,000% I don't have ADHD, because where I see my son and husband struggle with executive functioning, I've put all these things in place to not struggle, there. So I'm like, no, I definitely don't have ADHD. But, as I listened and heard more about why somebody might do that, that's a female and struggling with executive functioning, I'm like, oh, for sure. I've created all these different systems and lists and relists, and it's scary the amount of work I put into trying to stay organized. And there are seasons. I think the other part that spoke to me was I figure something out. And then, of course, as life always does, things change and more happens. And now my system's not working. And I panic. And then I go into a new season of hyper organization and focus to get it under control. And in your podcast with Dr. Hallowell, one of the topics he talked about is once you have children.
Yep.
And oh my gosh, I mean, having Mackenzie, my daughter, who's my older child, it's like just when I would figure out our schedule and how to feed her and nurse her and her routine for sleeping and changing and playing and going to bed. Well, now now you have to feed them solid foods. You're like, what? So I have to figure out like a whole new thing, and, and trying to figure out how to get out of the house the first time. I was like, how does anyone take a baby anywhere? This is insane. Like, who does this? And, you do it and you figure it out. But I remember that overwhelm in every new phase and thinking, what is wrong with me? Like, women have been doing this since the beginning of time. And for me, but I wouldn't articulate it to anybody else because I was ashamed. But for me, why is this so hard? Everybody else can figure this out. And are this basket case internally about whether or not you're doing a good job. And, so that really, resonated with me. And now RCF is like that. It was small and we're growing, and I was running it by myself, and we're still very, a small staff, but the opportunities and the things are coming at such a rate that it's getting to where it's hard to keep it organized.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. When you were talking about, all of the responsibilities, the first thing I wrote down was women, and I circled it. It is no surprise that women with ADHD struggle so much more as their responsibilities increase. And I mean, if you're a man and you can't get your kid out of the house and you can't get dinner on the table and you can't help them get their homework done, like nobody cares, right? Men aren't supposed to do that. It's because it's all hoisted on women.
Mm-hmm. And it's almost charming. Like if they attempt it, right? Like, oh, God bless him that he tried to make dinner. Whereas we're like complete failures if that didn't happen. And part of there's a societal piece, and then we buy into that. And yeah, it's so much. And then if you're a professional on top of that, and yeah, and then going into kind of then then having a child with any kind of learning difference or struggle, or a family member or a parent or whatever. I mean, it's just the caretaking, it just increases and increases, and the anxiety. I probably have always had some level of anxiety, but holy smokes, once I had a kiddo that was really struggling, I never experienced anything like that. So, yeah. And, I think some of the other things I would say would be stress and worry, and definitely like the body dysmorphia. I can really, relate to that. Always so hard on myself, and definitely never feeling like I was, good enough, and, just constantly feeling like I had to achieve something else always in order to feel good enough, and nothing's ever enough.
So you have that, and I can tell you do, you have that drivenness, ambition component as well, that's kind of your Hyperactivity.
For sure. And I consider it, a gift. It can, wear you into the ground, but it's also, when you, both with dyslexia and with ADHD, when we talk to individuals that are really highly successful, you constantly hear about that relentless drive, energy, grit, never giving up, resilience. I always, like I say, I've got a reason for everything. And I kind of attributed that to my father's work ethic and watching, my dad and really idolizing him. And he never took breaks and we never took vacations and he always worked really hard and I admired him. And so I just thought that I'm like that because my dad was like that and I admired his work ethic. But really, I think
Are you sure
that's,
you aren't like that because your dad was like that?
yeah. Well, that's the thing. You can really, if you're thinking about it, and I'm pretty cognitive, like I'm always wondering, I'm a fairly curious person
Of course you are.
and
You're
always,
ADHD.
yeah, exactly. So, you wonder those things and then you tell yourself a story and, I can make logical sense of the reason why I do things. And so that's definitely where my ADHD shows up for sure is just, I'm like a dog with a bone.
Yep. I use
hmm
that to describe myself all the time. So do you think your father was ADHD now with hindsight?
I really do, and it's that my family history is so interesting to me because there's a lot. Of, my father does not have any addiction, but there's a lot of addiction on both sides of my family. Entrepreneurs, inventors, and of course, no diagnosis of anyone of ADHD or dyslexia. And so when Reed was first going through the psychoed evaluation, of course, one of the first questions is, okay, so who in your family? And both my husband and I are like, nobody. And I remember her face, where she was kind of like, you know, and, and I remember kind of being offended, like, listen, do you think I'm not lying? I mean, I would tell you if, I'm not trying to hinder the process. But it was, clear that she's been doing this long enough to know, oh my goodness, you guys are so clueless. And we were. So my family is, it's interesting that even though I run a foundation about this, there is it's taken about 3 years to start getting some dialogue, but even to this day, I think my dad would totally disagree. That I think he would totally deny that, and I'm very careful of who I say in my family, I think, even though I feel pretty confident because there's this level of shame and the myths and the stigma, which is so wrong and so preventable, but it's so real. And so it's why I love what you're doing, and I love that you're talking about it. And I probably can talk about it to the point of being annoying, but I see how much damage it does to individuals and to families because of the lack of awareness and knowledge and truth and identification. And it needs to change.
Absolutely. So can I ask you, what did your dad do? Was he an entrepreneur?
So, my dad is actually an equine veterinarian.
Ah,
And so I grew up in well, he was a veterinarian, but ultimately specialized in equine veterinary medicine and was an orthoscopic surgeon, brilliant.
mm-hmm.
And then he also was a real estate broker. He also just recently, yeah,
Yep.
also recently, well, about, I don't know, maybe 8 to 10 years ago, got into literally like the tractor sales business and just sold this business. And he grew this business like crazy with no background knowledge, I mean, no business and knowing how to do that, but just did. And now he's he's working on actually a patent on a medication right now. And so, he's 70 years old and I don't think will ever not work. He works his brains out. He works harder than most people my age that, should be working as hard as he is. And I don't think he'll ever stop.
I can relate.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jen, talk to us about Reed Charitable Foundation. So you're a litigator, you have 2 kids, a super busy life. What made you decide that you had to do this?
Well, will make me tear up. It's my sweet baby boy, ultimately. I have a 15-year-old daughter, Mackenzie, who is not dyslexic. And school, everything came really easy to her. And by, 2 years old, she's recognizing letters and letter sounds. And I wasn't working with her. Of course, I read to my children since they were in utero. So of course they had access to words and those sorts of things. But, everything just came easy to her. And from a reading perspective, that was my experience too. I definitely worked hard in school. And things didn't, it's not like I got great grades just by not doing anything. I worked hard, but reading, I'm definitely not dyslexic. I picked up reading easily, and so did Ken's. And then 4.5 years later, with a lot of effort, I had my son Reed, and we actually lost a son before we had Mackenzie. And so I didn't think that God would give me another son, because I was so heartbroken from the loss of our first child. And so, there's this connection to him. He looked like our first, it's almost like the reincarnation of this son that we lost. And so there's a connection to Reed that's very, it's deep and cosmic, and there's something, more to it. But he's equally as bright and articulate, as his sister. But, when he was getting to 2 and 3, he was not recognizing letters and letter sounds. And, he was in the same little preschool that she had been in. And I moved him to another school and thought, oh, their director changed, and, maybe he needs to be at a different preschool. So I moved him to a different preschool, and, same thing, just really wasn't learning. But at the same time, everybody was like, he's bright. I mean, he's very articulate. He's a boy. Don't worry about it. Everybody catches up. And I think that, fit my gender stereotype for boys and girls. Girls mature faster. Kenzie, it just, any motherly instinct that I had, and it was very real, would get squashed and almost shamed out of me. Like, listen, we're the experts. You're a lawyer. We're teachers. We go to school for this. You go to school for that. And he was in fancy dancy private schools and whatnot. So
and you were doing the exact same thing with him. Actually, you were doing more than you were doing with your daughter, who needed nothing, right?
Yes.
Yeah, your situation totally mirrors mine. And so
I know.
You don't know what to do.
Right. And so then I moved him to the school that she was at when he was old enough, at K4, and he was going to have my best friend as his K4 teacher. And she became my best friend by being Mackenzie's K4 teacher.
My gosh.
Yes. So she's that kind of teacher. I mean, she's gifted and brilliant and loves these kids. She has her master's degree, just incredibly creative, loves these kids more than, in some cases, their parents love them. Just amazing. And so Reed had her, and, she would say the same thing to me. And I would ask her questions like, do you think he's dyslexic? Because he would do letter reversals. And of course, I didn't know any better at the time and thought that that's what dyslexia was. And she was like, well, at this age, letter reversals are typical. And, that's not really, what we look for. And she's like, really, the only kind of training I have is if they describe the words falling off the page. And she's like, I've asked him that, and he doesn't say that. So, he's a little boy, Jen. And, yeah, it's different than Ken's, but, I think it's fine. And so then fast forward to K5, I had her as his reading tutor, which is crazy that a 5-year-old would have a tutor, but he did. And, K5 kind of came and went, same thing. And we were working on, sight words, and my gosh, one day.
Can I ask your friend, what was her master's in?
Her master's was in elementary education. So not specifically reading and not specifically, ESE.
But still had
So,
no knowledge of dyslexia.
no, I mean,
Yeah. Yep.
you know how this really goes.
Yep.
And so, K-5, same deal. And then fast forward to first grade. Now he gets to wear a backpack to school and be a big kid at the school. And he's so excited. And he's such a social, kid, and just cannot wait to start first grade. But probably 2 weeks in to the first grade school year, the mornings started getting really bad. I can't get him out of bed. I can't get him dressed. I can't get him to brush his teeth. Where, he's forgetting a shoe when really he was like hiding the shoe. And at that point, I was still practicing law. So I'm like, I got to get to work, man. And I'm taking him to school and realizing he's missing a shoe. And now we're going
Oh,
back home.
jeez.
Yeah. I mean, it was like things are starting to kind of rapidly fall apart. And I couldn't put my finger on what the problem was. And he wasn't, he's just a little guy. He was only 6. So then I started getting phone calls at work every day around the same time. It started headaches and tummy aches. And then finally they wouldn't let him call me for that. So he started watching medical shows. He was watching The Good Doctor and getting medical jargon and using it. So now, the nurse is calling and she's giggling and she's like, he's here and he says he's got right side paralysis and he's just so cute and, myocardial infarctions. And I mean, it was so everybody, and now he was getting to do it because it was so adorable. But,
Hmm.
again, I'm at work and I'm like, okay. And because of the timing, and of course, lawyers track all time, I'm very acutely aware that it's kind of the same time every day. So I was like, it's adorable, but what class is he in? And of course, it was English language arts. But I kind of thought maybe he was getting bullied or something, but he's friends with everybody. So that didn't make a ton of sense. And it took it till November of his first grade year. And I was working with him on a spelling test and he just broke down. And he was just like, Mom, I mean, I can't ever say it without crying. Not in almost 4 years' time, but he was like, "Mom, I'm the dumbest kid in the school, and everyone makes fun of me and says Reed can't read, and I have to stand up in front of the class every day to read, and everybody laughs at me." And he's like, I don't belong in school, and he was 6.
Oh my gosh.
And he's brilliant, I mean, the other, and so I never had to go into the school before because everything was coming up roses for Ken's, but I went in and I met with the teacher and the lower school director, and teacher admitted, that that's what was happening. And her explanation for it was, there's just no reason he shouldn't be able to read. And he cares about what other kids think. So I just feel like, if we make him do that, eventually he's going to put in the effort. He's just being lazy.
It's like
And I was like,
ADHD, right?
yeah, yes.
Yeah.
And I
Just
was
try
like,
harder.
right. He's just not trying. And I was like, oh my gosh, let me just say this. He is not lazy. I'm like, we are killing ourselves at home. We are, there is no joy in education right now. I am killing and drilling this kid on sight words and spelling tests, and it's miserable, and I need help. Like, what do you suggest? The school's been around 50 years at that point. And, they were like, honestly, it sounds like you're doing everything you should be doing. And I was like, well, this is not working. He's falling apart and he's not having success. And we all agree that he should be having success. So what do I do? And, they were like, well, you could get him, have an academic evaluation. We don't think you're going to find anything. It's probably a waste of money. And really, we just think it's an effort issue. But everything was colliding for me, like the mom instinct and the clear effort that he was putting in and that I was putting in. And I felt like I was losing him, at 6, I'm like losing the spirit, this like happy, joyful, human. I was losing him. So we got the academic testing and we found out that he had dyslexia and dysgraphia. And the
Can
academic
you
tester
explain?
said,
Can you
sure,
explain what dysgraphia is?
sure. I mean, as you know, like this is not my expertise in terms of, the science and all of that. But, you know, dysgraphia is the getting the words on the page. So there's an OT component to it, a motor component to it, and he never has had OT. Everybody's always kind of said his pencil grip and
Occupational
those.
therapy.
That's right. That's right.
Hmm.
He's always had a decent pencil grip and those sorts of things, but he grips it really, really hard. There's a motor component to it for him. But there's also that combination of dyslexia and dysgraphia is kind of a beast. So, there's the reading, writing, spelling piece, how to spell a word, how to sound it out, but also trying to organize it. So there's, your thoughts and getting them on the piece of paper and in an organized way. So it also coincides with the executive functioning piece. And so that, and of course now he has, we know he has ADD too. So it's tough to describe it completely because Reed has this like trifecta of comorbidities that really fight against each other. And it's like if he just had one, it would be a little bit easier to kind of pull out where the struggle is. But I would say the dysgraphia, now that the ADD piece is under control and he's really had awesome remediation for dyslexia, it's the motor dysgraphia piece that is really hard for him. So, the key would be for kids with dysgraphia is to be able to type and to do speech to text because it's that motor piece of getting it on the paper. There's also an organization of thoughts that's hard, also with dysgraphia. So there's really two pieces to it. There is a cognitive, organizational piece, but also, like I say, when you have dyslexia, he's not only got to think about what he wants to say, which if he's saying it orally, oh my gosh, he'll talk your ear off and tell you the best story ever. But if he has to sit down and write it, now he's got to remember what he wants to say in the order, sit down and write it, and spell it correctly.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the Olympics of mental gymnastics for a kid that has all three things going on.
So is it fair to say that when we're talking about dysgraphia, I mean, the way the writing looks on the paper is it's really poor handwriting? And also, does it include, where I remember with my son, where he would just start writing on one side of the page and all of a sudden he'd be over completely on the other side. Like he could not address an
Yes.
envelope.
Yes, it's spacing,
Hmm.
it's size, and it's also just the handwriting itself. So, I mean, Reed's handwriting when it would come home prior to any support, I mean, it was scary. Like you're literally there's nothing to be read. It is like lines on it, random lines on a page. It might as well be abstract artwork.
Yes.
Right? Like, I mean, it's like, I don't know what to do with this. This is scary. Plus, once he got to where he was getting support for the dyslexia and we were actually starting to get some words, but the spacing would be crazy. So, if he was writing read, it would be like R, E next to each other, and then an
Yeah.
E, you know, a, a, an inch or more away from it. And then the D might be all the way at the end of the page or on the next line. So there's also like not an awareness that a word is a whole word
Yeah.
and it has to stay together. So, or you've got to put a dash and let somebody know, hey, this is still part of the same word if you're going to the next line. So there's that. And then also size. So these kiddos, and we still have this happen where you get a worksheet and, even the irony is sometimes it's like, here's a graphic organizer for your thoughts because you have dysgraphia and dyslexia and ADHD. So, and here's these little tiny bubbles. And, you're now expected to put all your thoughts in these little tiny bubbles. Well, he can't do that. He could type it and then print it out and cut out what he did and paste it into your little tiny bubbles. But if he's got to handwrite his idea into 10 little tiny bubbles, disaster town.
So once Reed's diagnosed, you go back to the school and you say, well, it's dyslexia. What happens next? What do they say?
Well, I'm thinking, oh, thank God, like they've been around for 50 years. This is this
Hmm.
highly lauded school that also everybody talks about. Oh my gosh, their English language arts program is amazing. These kids come out being incredible writers, understanding grammar. And so I'm like, oh my gosh. And I also am told 1 in 5 kids have dyslexia. So we are not the only folks to have, graced the halls of this school in the last 50 years. Of 1 in 5 children, have dyslexia. And
Well, and the thing is, I want to make sure that people understand this, or, our listeners understand this, that there's all different variations in dyslexia. It's like height, where you can have people
yeah,
that are really short, people that are in the middle, and people, that are really tall. And dyslexia is the same thing. So you may not struggle with it that much, or you can really, really struggle with it.
yeah,
Correct?
absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. It's and kind of like, autism, I talk about it like it's kind of a spectrum, there's really profound dyslexia and then there can be mild dyslexia. And in Reed's case, he was both mildly dyslexic and mildly dysgraphic, but that combo is nasty, and also this hidden ADD piece that nobody was talking about. So, that made a huge difference when we finally figured that out.
And
But
that's what's so important about this,
yeah.
because I think people think that, oh my gosh, if they're dyslexic, they can't do anything. And probably
Oh,
teachers think that too, right? But the truth of the
yes.
matter is there's so much that they can do that it masks the dyslexia.
Yes. And
And they're
that's how a
so
lot of kids
smart.
get missed, right? And that's, part of the definition of dyslexia is that it's an unexpected difficulty, and it's unexpected because they're so bright. So, this is not, and I think that's one of the big myths about dyslexia is that, oh, we all say that and all think that how quickly our child learns to read, write, or spell is indicative of how smart they
Mm,
are.
yeah.
And that's how school makes them feel too, because it's like this measure that we assess kids on in terms of their intelligence. But the truth is that intelligence has nothing to do with dyslexia. And typically, children with dyslexia, at a minimum, have an average IQ and typically are much higher than that. So, and it is how they get missed a lot because and Reed would have, if we had not been in crisis mode with his emotional state. And that's another thing. Like they end up having these emotional issues when they didn't start with them because they're so bright. He's sitting there like, it would almost be easier if they weren't bright and so that they didn't know, right? Like that they're like,
Yes.
oh, they
They
would have no
know they're not
awareness.
living to their potential. They know they're as smart. They can't show
Yes.
it, and they
And
don't
it's
know why.
just torture for them.
Okay,
Um,
so you went back to the school. You thought that they'd
yes.
have all these services, and you discover
Crickets
nada.
and tumbleweeds, crickets and
Yeah.
tumbleweeds. And also I got this term Orton-Gillingham from the neuropsych of eval. And she's like, he has to have this. And of course, I have no idea what that is, but I can research. And so I start doing that. And there, at that time, this is almost 4 years ago now, there was one tutor in Central Florida who was qualified at any level, certified at any level in the Academy of Orton-Gillingham to tutor students with dyslexia. And of course, her wait list was a mile long and it's very expensive. And we're not getting it in school, but we need it 5 days a week. So now we're going to take whatever we can get whenever we can get it, which then means no activities after school. So, at the time he was playing t-ball with a group of boys from his school that he adored. And it was just a great group of parents, great group of boys and girls. And we had to stop that. And it was something he was good at, but we can't not read. So it was like, okay, we've got to give up this thing. And I will say I went into it so naive. Even though I was told this is what he needs, I still didn't understand what dyslexia was. I thought, okay, he reverses his letters or he reads backwards or something, and we'll do this little tutoring thing for a while, and poof, it'll all be better, and he won't read backwards anymore, and moving on. even with the diagnosis, I did not have a clue what this really looked like and what was really going to be our life. But, pretty quickly, I'm sitting there in these tutoring sessions. I'm leaving work early. Everybody's kind of rolling their eyes. Oh, she's leaving again. Of course, I'm up till like 3 o'clock in the morning getting my work done. It's not like I'm letting things fall by the wayside. My daughter is resentful because she feels like everything's about Reed and
Yeah.
our whole, right? So that's creating a huge problem. I'm not, to your point earlier, I'm not cooking dinners anymore because now once we get home from tutoring, which, is like 6 o'clock at night, now we also have homework still left to do. So, we weren't finishing, this little boy was not finishing his day until about 8 o'clock. And sometimes later, because sometimes he would fall apart and we would walk the streets of the neighborhood crying, both of us, just so overwhelmed and frustrated and scared, scared. Like, what does this mean? And I just, of course, I was talking about it, which I say, of course, obviously, most people don't talk about this, but maybe I'm an oversharer because of ADHD. But I'm like, I'm looking for my 1 in 5. Like, who are my, like, where's our tribe? Who are the people that are going through this ahead of me that I can ask for advice? Like, what do we do? Are we going to be okay? And there was nobody, it was like, except for the moms that were in the waiting room at the tutoring, and we may or may not make eye contact with each other, like, you may or may not be talking about this. I felt completely alone and like I was going to lose Reed. And I think the piece of that I can see now that I was so scared and that makes me cry is, we'd already lost a child and
Yeah.
I didn't know. I think the only reason I survived it besides faith was that I didn't know what was coming next. It was like, you didn't know,
Yeah,
you're
it's
just
got to get
going.
better. It's got to get better, right? It's hope.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And so with Reed, it was this sense of like, there's so many ways we can lose a child. And as I'm reading about dyslexia and I'm learning about addiction and depression and suicide rates and incarceration and all these things, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's 1,000 ways I can lose this boy, and I cannot survive losing him. And so the motivation, not only to get him what he needed and see the impact that it was having on him, but then recognizing that there are so many families who do not have access to what we have access to that are just as worthy and deserving and capable as my son, and their parents love them just as much as I love Reed, and they are not getting what they need. So we have to make this training accessible to all teachers so that all children can get it, because the suffering that these children go through and what it can do to them for the rest of their lives is completely preventable. Completely preventable.
Oh my gosh. So I think about my son. He went to a Catholic elementary school. Then I think in 5th grade, he went to a pricey country day type school. Then he went back to the Catholic junior high school. Then he went to a huge public high school. Then he went to a small independent startup high school founded by a billionaire. And then he went back to the Catholic high school to do his last year of high school. And I mean, he went from expensive schools, really expensive schools, to mid-range, to a Catholic, to public high schools. And, nobody knew really what ADHD was, but they knew even less about dyslexia. All of the struggles he had in all the different classes, and no one ever suggested dyslexia. So how big of a problem is this? Would you say that our county is really not unusual?
Oh, for sure, 1,000%. And I mean, I talk to people globally about dyslexia. As a foundation, we are talking to people globally all the time. It is a global issue. It is not a state issue. It is not just a US issue. It is not just a your district issue. It is a global issue. And I also believe that when we say 1 in 5 or 20%, I genuinely believe that that is grossly, grossly underestimated. And part of that is because if you look at our nation's report card, 65, 66% of fourth graders can't read on grade level. And then that number gets worse when they test again at eighth grade. So clearly we're doing something wrong. I mean, that surely it can't be that 65% of our kids not being able to read at grade level is an acceptable standard. But, how many of those kids even have, mild dyslexia, maybe not with dysgraphia, but when you get the proper instruction, I mean, it's game changing. And I think that about ADHD too. Oh my gosh, now that I know what it is between dyslexia and ADHD, I spend a lot of time diagnosing people in my head. I don't always say it. And the same thing with when I watch sports programs, when I watch documentaries, when I watch movies or musicians or actors and actresses that I just think are mesmerizing or so incredibly gifted at a sport, they're the best of the best, like you can't take your eyes off of them. I have gotten into a habit of Googling, is so and so dyslexic and or ADHD. And I would say 8 times out of 10, when somebody is just awe-inspiring to me and I do that search, you find out that they're one of the ones. My family always rolls their eyes now because when they see me watching something and I get on my phone, they're like, "Oh no, she's going to do it again." I'm like, "Guess who's dyslexic?
I
Guess who has
completely agree.
ADHD?"
I think neurodivergence is predictive of brilliance,
It
basically.
is. It is.
And
If you don't get squashed.
right, exactly. Exactly. In all the shame and don't
Yes.
they just need to know what it is so that they can build the workarounds, because you can't build anything if you don't understand why your brain works the way it works. Now, when it comes to ADHD, I have seen numbers all over the place as far as the percentage of people who have ADHD who also have dyslexia. I think I've seen numbers as high as 60%. Is
Mhm.
that your understanding as well?
Yeah, so in the Orton-Gillingham training that we do through the academy, one of our fellows says that it's at least 50%. And then with boys, there is an exponential percentage above that. So even more common that a boy with dyslexia would also have ADHD. So if you have one, you've got to be looking for the other. And great if that's not the case. But my gosh, what I found with Reed, once we identified the ADD piece and he chose to do medicine, that was a decision that we provided to him. And he was 10 when he decided. And I let Reed is old enough now, and we talk about it so much that I include him in those decisions. And I said, this is something you should know exists. And you may not decide you have any interest in it ever, or maybe you only have interest in college or in high school when, things ramp up. But you should know that, for 80% of people with ADD, this can really help. And it may not work for you. It is like, I mean, literally the first day that he took it, by the end of the day, he came to me 10 years old and he's like, "Mom, this medicine is crazy." And I was like, "It is." I said, "Is it making you feel bad?" She said, like you could have a headache or or
Hmm.
be dizzy. And he's like, "No, it's nothing like that." He goes, "It's making me feel like I want to do school when I don't want to do school." Oh my gosh, Reed. And now he will say, he will say, "It changed my life." And that he's so much happier because he was so frustrated. Even with Orton-Gillingham, he was doing so good, but still, like, just the effort involved, just that sustained effort when something's really hard, to have the support of medication has absolutely changed his life.
Oh, that is just so lovely to hear.
Yeah.
So, the one thing that I wanted to mention is I think the thing that has been most shocking to me is that people who specialize in reading, so they get a master's in reading, they have no training in dyslexia as part of that master's in reading. how can that be? If dyslexia is, you're struggling to read, how can they not have any training on dyslexia? Do you have any idea why?
I have a lot of theories on why after spending, and honestly, I talked to a number of universities, particularly local, but there's a few things. One, there, even PhD, we have had PhDs take the Orton-Gillingham training, that, are speech language pathologists and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't know this. Or, I understood the science. Sometimes people will get, if you're at that level, the PhD level, you might have the pedagogy on the science of reading and how the human brain actually learns to read. But they admit that no one ever gave them the practical implementation piece of how you actually implement that with a human being that needs you to teach them how to read. So, but the most common um, feedback we get every single training we do, teachers always cry, and there's nothing sad about the training. I mean, it's actual physical training of how to do it. But the longer you've been teaching, particularly little guys and gals. And every year you have kids that you can't teach how to read. And you think, why can't I do that? Why do I always miss some? And then you realize that if you just had this instruction, not only could you have helped that kiddo, but you could have helped that parent. And you could have had some discussions as opposed to they're lazy or not trying or stupid or, all these other things that these poor kids believe about themselves, and the guilt that the parents feel. But the longer teachers have been teaching, the longer they cry about the realization that it was really quite simple and quite preventable. But I think there's a lot of reasons. There's obviously big lobbies for curriculum, and there are not big lobbies for science-based curriculum. This is a billion-dollar business curriculum. So there, with all problems, I think ultimately there's people that are benefiting and people that are suffering. So, and money is usually a part of that. But there's a humbleness required. If you've been a professor or a teacher for a long time, and a realization that there might be a better way to do it, and that what you've been doing may not have been effective for a lot of kids. That's hard. I mean, that really takes a level of humbleness that is hard, and a level of realization that um, I lost a lot. I failed a lot of people along the way, but it's not their fault. I mean, I guess that's the thing. You don't know what you don't know. And I feel sorry for teachers when I talk to them, because what I hear a lot is I have been feeling like, for however long I've been teaching, I missed the day, or I wasn't paying attention on the day that they told us how to do this. And then I went to school to teach children, and I assume everybody else knows it, and I don't. And I can't possibly say to anyone that I don't know how to do this, because it is fundamentally the basis of my job. How can I tell a parent, I don't really know how to teach your child to read if they don't just memorize it and pick it up? I mean, how can they say that? They're going to go to my principal and they're going to tell them, and I'm going to lose my job. There's a huge level of shame for everybody, is what I have found. And I'm grateful to get to do the work that we do and get to talk to teachers, because I have a softness that I did not have when Reed was struggling. And I was so angry about why they wouldn't have this knowledge, because as parents, we expect that they do. and they've just never gotten it. It's just not there's very few colleges of education that provide real instruction on the science of reading. And it's one of the things as a foundation we're working really hard to try to change, because what we're doing is going back and back training teachers that should have gotten this at the College of Education pre-service level. So the hope is, that we can really start changing this at the College of Education level, so that every time there's a graduation, we aren't then going, oh man, how many more teachers do we have to go back and train in this basic knowledge, which, by the way, is vital for dyslexic students, but it is also the best instruction for all kids. That's what's so crazy. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want that. My child doesn't have a learning difference. My child doesn't have dyslexia. We don't need this. This is remediation. Well, it is essential for dyslexic students to get it without question. But it is also the best for your child, including my daughter, Mackenzie. Reed was able to sound out a word that it was actually the word incendiary that Mackenzie, even though she's a 99th percentile English language arts student, could not sound out because she'd never been given the skills. She is just an excellent memorizer, has awesome working memory, and when she sees it a couple of times, she knows it.
Have you found that there are certain states that are doing a good job with dyslexia versus others? Or are
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Northeast is definitely more aware, and there are more dyslexia specific private schools up in the Northeast. Virginia, one of the fellows that we work with through the academy, she actually has the contract with the Department of Education for the state of Virginia to train teachers in Orton-Gillingham. So they're, kind of working on that there. They don't have as systemized a process as what we're trying to do here in Orange County, Florida. But, there are definitely states that are a little bit more aware. But I will say, Arkansas is the state that has the best legislation on dyslexia. And, they've got a group of advocates that are incredible and have worked for the last decade to get the best legislation. But what they don't have is the support of the school districts and administrators and teachers. So they're still having an incredibly hard time because they don't have the buy-in of the very people that need to implement the legislation. So it's an enormous battle that I have to admit that there are some days I just don't understand why everybody's fighting this. If really we are a country of opportunity, if that's really true, the very first thing we have to do is teach our children, the 95% of them that are cognitively able to read, how to actually read. And the statistics for individuals who cannot read proficiently is staggering. And so I genuinely believe that if we are successful in our mission of making sure that every teacher's trained so that every child can read, that there isn't a single societal cause that isn't drastically improved. All these things we talk about, from, mental health issues to, societal issues and race, to finding, the cure for cancer and, COVID and political. I mean, these brains, these neurodiverse brains, dyslexia, ADHD, these are the innovators, the creators, the entrepreneurs, the out of the box thinkers. They solve the problems that neurotypical folks cannot, because those folks have to stay within the rules and within the box. They're stuck in there.
Yeah.
And I honestly feel sorry. Like it's yes, you can toe the line and you sit in class perfectly and you don't move a muscle and you don't speak out of turn. And, there's I guess a time and a place for that that's really appreciated. But at the end of the day, once you get out of school, what we really need are problem solvers.
The in the box people, we need them to work for us, right?
Yes. Yes.
we tell them what to do.
We say a few different things about that in our household, but yes, absolutely. We need those people too. The best organizations, I think, have both.
So how do you choose what teachers get to be part of your program and get to be trained in Orton-Gillingham? Like, how does that all work? Are you going state by state? Is it whoever reaches out to you? How does that
So
work?
that, yeah, so it kind of it started initially really even before RCF started, that locally my husband and I were paying privately to send teachers to training that wanted it, or if a parent came to us, because I got trained in the 60 hours 3 years ago, and just mind blown. So I was like, holy smokes, that this is worth investing in. People should have this, and so that's how we started. Then we started the foundation because there were other people that wanted to invest in getting teachers trained. And so it really started off anybody that came to us, if we had the money to do it, we would, and we could find a training, we would get them in the training. Then as a foundation, we actually started, doing our own training. So we weren't working through a third party, which also helped us to really reduce the cost. So a lot of people are making money off of this that really shouldn't be. So that's another just fundamental problem, which is why the foundation is so important. But we were training teachers here locally, and we developed a partnership with our district, which is Orange County Public Schools. We're the ninth largest school district in the country. They allowed us to train 80 teachers in January. And the feedback from those teachers was so not only overwhelmingly positive in terms of like best professional development we've ever had, but also this is vital information that I can't just know this. Like my whole team has to know this. This is how we change things for kids. So our district has asked us to scale the training for all 15,000 of their K through fifth grade teachers, including ESE, reading interventionists, reading coaches. So that's a huge, I mean, I thought it would take us a decade to get to the point where somebody, a big district, would ask us to do something like that. So what we do now, in order to honor that commitment, but also make it accessible to other teachers, whenever we do a training, we give 50% of the spots to Orange County Public Schools, because because it is a large district, the data coming out of the district is important and persuasive, hopefully, for other districts to potentially follow. So we want to make sure we do it really well here, and that teachers are getting implementation support, and that they're doing it to fidelity, because obviously that's critical. It's not just enough to get trained. I kind of liken it to law school. You and I got out of law school, and you really have no idea how to practice law. It's all theory. And, I had the gift of getting to do trial team. And so I did know how to function in a courtroom. And many of my peers did not, because I did it all the time. And I was constantly critiqued by, practicing lawyers and sitting judges. And so I really had great experience in that. But if I hadn't had that, I feel bad for anybody that graduates law school and then is expected to go, argue a motion. You don't even know which, table you're supposed to sit at. No one tells you that.
So true.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. Like the teachers get trained, but they need some implementation support. So we have staff that helps with that, and they do it for free. So the other 50% of the spots that we offer are open to anybody anywhere. So we have trained teachers in 22 different states in this past year. In January, we have a teacher training from Nigeria.
Oh,
She will be
love it.
up in the middle of the night for 5
Wow.
days to get the training, because right now we're only able to offer it Eastern Standard Time. We're working on changing some things, being able to kind of scale it, but right now that's how it is. And also a teacher in Hawaii. And we provide the training for free for public school educators, as long as they provide proof of current employment in the college of or in a public school district. And they also have to provide a formal letter from their administration that they will be allowed to use what they learn in the training with students during the school day. This training does typically cost anywhere from 800 to, I've seen it as high as $4,000 per teacher. So it is expensive, and it's in high demand. So we want to make sure if we're sending somebody for free and they're taking a spot, that they're able to actually use it with students. And it's not just, PD that they're putting on their continuing education. And then for anybody else that's not public school, the cost is $200.
So it's not very much.
No, it's not. I mean, like I say, we're the only ones that I know of in the country that provide that training at that cost. So when we announced it the first time, it was in December of last year, and we had a March training date from our fellow. She was going to train 24 teachers. It was going to be virtual because of COVID. And it was spring break for Orange County. And so I was like, I just don't think we're going to get enough teachers to want to do it here locally because everybody needed a break. And so I said, let's just open it up. Let's just open it up on our Facebook page. And, anybody, whoever fills the first 24 spots gets them. Well, I didn't really realize what that was going to do. And we had over 375,000 people from every continent that I know of, except
What?
Antarctica. Yes.
Wow.
Trying to get the training. It broke the internet. So Kim Kardashian and OG Training are capable of breaking the internet, apparently. There's a huge, huge need for it. And I hope that, we can help others do this in other places, even if they aren't Reed Charitable Foundation, but that we can help other groups to start providing this training because teachers are desperate for it. Parents are desperate for it. And it is life-changing. And for Reed, I should just say, he just had to have his follow-up, so every 3 years, they have to have a follow-up psycho-ed evaluation to keep their accommodations and things like that in school. Reed just tested like he is no longer dyslexic, which of course we know that's not true. He'll always be dyslexic, but he is remediated for dyslexia. He needs the second half. So he's in 5th grade. He needs the Latin and Greek. That's kind of the next, phase of OG training, but he is remediated for purposes of his grade level. And his IQ went up another 19 points.
Oh my gosh.
I know. And his neuropsych evaluator was like, this is what happens when kids get Orton-Gillingham 5 days a week to Fidelity during the school day. It is life changing and it is brain changing. He's got all the gifts that come with dyslexia and ADHD, but a rewiring of the neural pathways so that he is reading more like someone who is not dyslexic.
Okay, so can you talk real briefly about why this is so important to get this training when these kids are young? Because remember, I've got this 19-year-old who's in college now.
I know. Yeah. I mean, well, too, so first of all, there's the neuroplasticity piece, right? Like it's easier when they're little to get this training and for it to impact their brains than when you're older and, there's less neuroplasticity. But also, to me, the bigger piece is the self-esteem piece. And I mean, it only took till 6 years old for Reed to think he was the dumbest boy in the school and that he didn't belong in school and needed to quit. I mean, it doesn't take long for a child for it to destroy their self-esteem. And it is so hard to get that back. So the sooner that they can be identified, and, in some cases, for example, some of our inner city schools where teachers are getting trained in OG, those children are never going to be able to have their parent go pay $1,200 or $2,000. It depends where you are. In New York, it can be up to, I think, like $5,000 or $7,000 to get, the actual diagnosis through a neuropsych. And so many, many children will never, ever, ever get an actual identification of ADHD or dyslexia. But if their teachers are properly trained in how to provide that support from the very beginning, those kiddos don't have to necessarily be identified to get the support that they need to be successful. And it doesn't mean they're going to be, as quick a reader as Kenzie is, who's not dyslexic, but they have to be able to have the ability to read. And then the beauty of an identification is also that, you get to start learning about the strengths. If you've got teachers that are educated and like, hey, here's where the struggles are, but this is how you support it. But also don't forget, here are the gifts. And you've got to be looking for those things. These kids tend to be great artists. They tend to be incredible athletes. They're the builders. They're the math geniuses who, are going to be the engineers. These kids reads like the king of negotiation. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Teachers hate it when they're little because they want you to be quiet and sit there and don't come up with any brilliant suggestions on how I could do it different. But if we don't squash that gifting, it is what he's going to do with the rest of his life. And so knowing where the gifts lie is so important. And every one of them has at least one unique gifting. It's just finding it.
I could not agree more. And I think that they become fearless too.
Yeah.
They're problem solvers because there's always a wall up, right?
Yep,
and so they have to
yep.
figure out how to get around the wall. That assumes that their mental health is still intact. And I think that for so many of these kids, ADHD or dyslexia, that's probably the biggest problem. All of the shame that then leads to, serious mental health issues.
For sure. And addiction. I look,
Yes.
like I say, I look back in my family and knowing what I know now, I see where this came from. And I was so scared when Reed first got diagnosed and I was reading the statistics about addiction. I was like, oh my gosh, Andrew has it on, my husband on both sides of his family. I have it on both sides of my family. Oh my gosh, he doesn't stand a chance. Well, then I start really researching and understanding that, if you don't have it, it's more about not having an identification and not getting proper support. That once you, and feeling so bad about yourself and the shame and all those things that come with it, that once they're old enough that they're not under your thumb, they self-medicate. And that's where the addiction is coming from, and not from, taking medication. I was very resistant. I'm one of those moms that had plenty of misinformation about ADHD medication and thinking, oh, I'm going to introduce this gateway drug, for him. I mean, it's so sad. And only because of you and Dr. Hallowell and Dr. Bradshaw, I'm lucky enough to have been surrounded by knowledgeable, curious, responsible people giving good information that allowed me to get rid of some nonsensical data I'd read somewhere, like in GQ magazine or something silly, like I really think I read an article about how we're medicating our boys. And I think it was in a GQ article.
There was one in the New York Times.
Yeah. And so that I read it before Reed was at this stage, and I was like, oh, that's terrible. I just can't believe we would do that. That's a awful thing that we would do. And it was going to prevent me from providing my son with the very thing that could change his life. It's just, so it's the key is continuing to talk about it, I think, and raising awareness and getting good people and knowledgeable people in the conversation and admitting what they know and don't know. I'm not an expert, but I have got a ton of anecdotal data, and I am working in a foundation where we are talking to individuals with ADHD and dyslexia globally and training teachers and seeing that data and the impact. And this is a completely preventable problem that will really change our world for the better for everyone, whether you're impacted by dyslexia and ADHD or not.
Well, and the thing about it too is, the comments about addiction, if you look at the studies, it's actually the converse. So
Yes.
There's a 50% less chance of addiction for kids that are medicated.
Yeah.
For ADHD. And I think it's with stimulant medication. So,
yes.
Okay, I've got one last question for you, Jen. Okay. What do you think the key to living successfully with ADHD and let's say dyslexia as well? What do you think the key is?
I think it's twofold. But the major one is it's a balance. I think there's a remediation piece um, for both. That's really, really important. And so, Orton-Gillingham is that for dyslexia. As it relates to ADHD, it is potentially medication or, coaching and learning workarounds if medication is not an option or not successful, for you. Understanding what it really is and, where you're going to need support is critical. And then the other piece, I believe, for both of them is the strengths. You have to know that you have incredible strengths because of it. And so I don't accept the terminology of a disability at all as it relates to dyslexia. These kids are not learning disabled, they are more than capable of learning. Their environment is disabling currently.
Yes. Yes. Same
And
thing for
once,
ADHD.
absolutely. And so, you know, I just think that knowing your strength, and I see that in Reed. I didn't get to know it until I was a grown up and kind of already knew I had a strength, but I didn't really understand why. But I'm so happy that my son gets to see, yep, reading and writing and spelling was initially a really hard struggle. And, it's always going to be a little bit harder for you, particularly if you have to handwrite something because of dysgraphia. But, I also always talk about in this day and age, you're never going to turn in a handwritten report, kiddo. So like, it's going to be fine, learn how to type and learn how to do speech to text. But the bigger piece is like, but Reed, here are these gifts that you have.
Yes. Lovely. So, Jen, where can people find you if they want to know more about you? They want to know more about Reed Charitable Foundation.
Yeah, our website is www.reedcharitablefoundation.org, and that's REED, charitablefoundation.org. It is a little sad that it's that long, so that someone with dyslexia has to spell that. But that is the best place to find us. We also have a YouTube channel. We're also on Facebook and Instagram. And then also our email address that actually goes directly to me is info@reedcharitablefoundation.org.
And so, if someone's listening and they want to contribute to the Reed Charitable Foundation, where do they go? Is that on the website as well?
It is. Right at the top banner, there is a donate button, and it's currently PayPal, and it's about to get, there's multiple steps, and we're learning all about website optimization and donation optimization, all that good stuff. But yeah, it's right there at the top of the page.
You know what? I think it is just crazy and so amusing that you named your son Reed. Like, how does that even happen?
I know, and that we didn't spell it READ. I have to say, I don't think that things happen by accident. I really, I
Totally
believe,
agree. Yeah.
yeah, that there is a purpose for everything, and we took a name that we loved, and then he hated it for a little while, and now we've turned it into something really positive again.
That's just lovely. So, all of those links are going to be in the show notes. Jen, thank you so much for spending time with us here today. I want you to know this is the longest podcast episode we've ever recorded. You had so much to say, and you just said it in such a way that I think that so many parents, and not even parents, because, we've all been kids at one point. So I always want to encourage our listeners that just because it's about children, it doesn't mean that it doesn't involve you, because you're going to learn so much about yourself by listening to all of these episodes, right?
Yeah, it's so true. Well, I have a tendency to talk too long, Tracy, so I blame this on ADHD also.
I know, but I make jokes all the time about, all the bro podcasts, right? They're 2 hours and 3 hours. And, and
so
I'm
true.
always worried about, oh my God, are we going to go over an hour? So I'm like, screw it. I just loved everything that you were saying. And I think the world needs to know about this. So thank
you. Thank you for the opportunity to do it. And truly, I couldn't mean it more. I just think you are killing it and you're helping so many people, including myself. So thank you so very much.
Absolutely. It is my complete and total pleasure. So that's what I have for you for this week. If you like this episode with Jennifer Knopf, I had to constantly think about, because it's spelled Knopf. And because I'm German, I always want to say Knopf. And so I have to stop myself. Anyway, let us know by leaving a review. Our goal is to change the conversation around ADHD, helping as many women as we possibly can learn how their ADHD brains work so that they too may discover their amazing strengths. So I'm half German and I'm half Japanese, because people are going to look at me and look at my name and say, wait, you're German? So anyway, your reviews, they really help in that regard. As always, you're listening to ADHD for Smartass Women. Come join me over at tracyotsuka.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you here next week. You've been listening to the ADHD for Smartass Women podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Otsuka, and we're available on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Not coincidentally, ADHD for Smartass Women, it's also the name of our free Facebook group. We're a totally smartass community of successful, ambitious women who share our ADHD wins, questions, and workarounds. Join us at tracyotsuka.com, where you can also find more information on our Your ADHD Brain is A-OK system. I spy a happier life for us, and I'll see you again next week.